and welcome to a very special EWTN on-location bookmark. We're coming to you from the set of Sunday Night Prime at Yonkers, New York, and we had to come here to see the one and only Father George Rutler and talk to him about a couple of his books, The Principalities and Powers, Spiritual Combat, 1942 to 43, and also Cloud of Witnesses, which has a killer title underneath it, Dead People I Knew When They Were Alive. And Father Rutler is so busy here in New York and his parish, it's tough to get him down to EWTN anymore. We've been shooting all your series up here over the years, right?
Right. I started going to Alabama. That was about 27 years ago. Mm-hmm. But it's easier here. New Yorkers don't travel too much.
Right, that's right. Well, you don't even have a car, right?
I last drove about 12 years ago. Okay. I did drive about a year ago on one trip. I tried to drive. I had several priests in the car. And I said I'd like to drive, so I got behind the wheel and I said, you know, it's 12 years since I was behind the wheel of a car, but they say it's like swimming. When you learn, you never forget. Mm-hmm. They all began to scream and I had to stop.
So we're talking about Principalities and Powers, Spiritual Combat, 1942 to 43. Now this was a book, I know when it's, I get books, they show up in your office and you kind of pick it up and you think, well, what is this? It's got this picture on the front of, looks like American soldiers possibly kneeling in a Catholic bombed out church or cathedral. On the front looks like a World War II story, and I see George William Rutler, and I think, well, that's got to be Father Rutler. Is he writing war books now?
Well, that picture is a wonderful picture, actually, of Cologne Cathedral after it was bombed. And I think those are obviously Allied soldiers. Very moving. It's at the consecration, and they have their guns with them because they were, still under attack or under threat. All right. So that was a German cathedral. The whole world suffered in the Second World War, and so many innocent people suffered. And the terrible aesthetic destruction was a sign of the moral destruction underway. And of course the cathedral's been rebuilt now, but I think that picture, which I didn't choose, it was the publisher, as I remember, found that picture. It expresses how the war really was an attack on God. And that's why I call that spiritual combat. The war was not simply a political affair. You were dealing with real evil. And unless we understand that there is evil, we will never understand how so much cruelty took place. And that's why I quote St. Paul to the Ephesians at the beginning, that we are fighting against principalities and powers, not of this world. It was a spiritual combat, and it brought out, of course, the worst in people, but also the best.
Well, one might say, okay, that sounds very interesting, and then you pick out 1942 to 43. People think, well, the war, 39 or 1941. Why 42 and 43? There's a reason behind that time period, right?
Yeah, it's a simple reason. I mean, I had a friend once who was a biblical scholar, and he was talking about why the chronology in the fourth gospel, St. John, is different from the synoptic gospels. And he said maybe the simplest explanation is that St. John just had these different scrolls and they got dropped and he put them back together again that way. Of course, he was being facetious. The only reason I picked that a year was that the documents I had were from that year. These were all newspaper magazines and things like that.
And they were from what? Mostly the tablet? Is that the major place?
Primarily, our other newspapers.
And that was a paper, it's a Catholic paper still today, right? That's
in London.
In London, right.
Because even paper was rationed at that time. It was poor quality paper and crumbling. And fortunately, now these can be stored on the computer. So it's a vignette. That year it was a vignette of the whole war, of course. But in June '42, I mean, that's when the Japanese invaded the Philippines. The Germans moved in on North Africa. MacArthur's over there in a Corregidor. When we call this a world war, it really was.
Right.
Everybody was involved in that.
Right. Right. In fact, really the first upside for the Americans in June of '42 was basically Midway, which really was what turned things around, at least started to turn things around actually in the Pacific during that period of time. Now, you say here that the period covered in the pile of newspapers and journals and radio transcripts left to me by a friend and historian, Monsignor Florence Cohalan. So how did you know him? Were you friends for years?
Well, he was my best teacher, and I never had a class from him. He taught in the minor seminary, Cathedral College, the Archdiocese of New York, for many years. As a youth, he had a heart condition. He was not expected to survive. Well, he lived to be 93, and he collected everything. He was in retirement when I knew him. We both lived in the same rectory in New York, St. Agnes, right by the Chrysler Building.
Okay.
So every meal, every day was a class. So I picked up so much from him.
In a theological, historical, both?
Every way. I mean, he knew the genealogy and the godparents of every king and queen, you know, from the start. Yeah, but one line that made a deep impression on me, in fact, I refer to this in the book I did called Crisis of Saints. He said that viciousness in history has done much harm. Immorality has offended individual souls. But the worst crimes, worst disasters in history have been the work of the timid, mediocrity, people who just want to live a pleasant life. So weakness, he would say weakness has done more harm to civilization than wickedness.
So you talk about World War II, and you kind of were talking about that a little bit, about the idea that you see it can probably only be appreciated as a holy war fought for multiple and mixed motives. So what do you mean multiple and mixed motives?
Well, of course, I mean, the war started because of political reasons, but it was also a noble crusade to preserve.
Of course, you're not supposed to use that word anymore.
Well, they did. They were crusaders. It was a crusade.
Well, that was even Eisenhower's book, was Crusade in Europe.
Absolutely.
Right. Yeah.
And it's always difficult. It's wrong to play Monday morning quarterback with history.
Isn't that what we do all the time now?
Yeah. If I were there, I would have been a hero and all, but we don't know that. Some of the most valiant deeds were done by people who were rather anonymous, who never expected to be brave. And others were supposed to have been brave in moral crisis, and they were not. So I wanted to highlight some of these individuals, some people who grew into heroism. There are some of the, for instance, in Austria, some of the bishops there in the Anschluss, when the Nazis came in at first, they welcomed them, some more reluctantly than others, and it was only when they got a taste of what this was all about that they became heroic.
Well, you said here, having taken 1 year of it as a template for the whole conflict, I've tried to highlight figures, some remembered, others neglected, as ciphers for the many ways people behave in different circumstances. How are you using that word cipher? What do you mean when you say cipher?
Well, they represent different elements of our personality. And also they show how one grows and is shaped by circumstances. For instance, in the 1920s, Mussolini was considered a noble and heroic figure by Winston Churchill, called him a genius. The great writer Chesterton, one of my heroes, wrote a book, Resurrection of Rome, in which he salutes Mussolini. Franklin Roosevelt called him a great gentleman.
He made the trains run on time.
The Italian, right. But it was only afterwards that they began, they learned the hard way. And they understood that they had to learn. Unfortunately, a lot of people were too proud to admit their mistake.
Right, and I know you even talk about what happened in Nazi Germany and what went on there, and the idea many times people, I think sometimes people project the Nazis as if they're just crazy people, rather than realizing that there was also the idea of the reaction against the communist threat, which was seen as the big threat. Basically, after the First World War in Germany, those were the two big groups, and that we have to be careful of thinking those things can't happen here.
Exactly, because that is what makes them happen here. And that is true. In the 1930s, so many of the European sophisticates said that Hitler could not really mean what he's writing about in Mein Kampf. Only a madman would really believe that. Well, he was mad. But I learned after about 8 years as a chaplain in a state mental hospital, which may have taken its toll, that you can be very crazy and very smart. Mm-hmm. That's a very volatile combination. Mm-hmm. But in the 1930s, the people did say, well, the National Socialists would be a buffer against the Bolsheviks. Right. But they didn't know that they were feeding a monster that way. In the same way today in our culture, I think there are a lot of secularists who really resent Judeo-Christian civilization, and therefore they're very tolerant of any force. I mean, when we deal with Islamic terrorism, for instance, there are many people who rather would look the other way because this is an attack on a Christian civilization. Right.
Yeah, it's always perplexing why that seems to be, everything else is allowed.
Yeah.
No matter how much, this group would be the first group to get rid of those people. They'd be on the top of the list to be gotten rid of.
Exactly. But they don't realize that. Right. In the same way that in the 1930s they didn't realize what the Nazis were going to do.
Right. Now, you also said here that, I know I didn't think you were that old, that you claimed to have been on a ship in wartime in World War II. Is that true?
Yes, I think I was 2 months old, so that was it. I remember
You were on a Liberty ship or something, right?
One of the Liberty ships.
Right.
It had come in. My father was in the Merchant Marine. He'd been in North Africa, the South Pacific, and the Murmansk run, which was one of the deadliest in the war.
Right, sure.
He was one of the few survivors. But they were in Port Newark at one time, and my mother went down. My mother just took me so my father could see me, and I had my diaper changed on a Liberty ship. So I can say I was on a ship in the Second World War, but as I said, it was rather an inferior capacity.
Mm-hmm. So you never filed for any sort of retirement benefits or anything based upon that?
No, but I'll tell you, what was very touching, after my father died, I found in a drawer all kinds of medals that he never displayed. Mm-hmm. And he'd been decorated by the Russian Federation when it changed later on, and France. But I always found that with men who've really been in combat in that period, be very reluctant to talk about it because they survived, and they realized, there were many who didn't survive, and it
was almost sometimes a kind of a guilt people would sometimes feel about that, as to why did I make it and someone else didn't, because so much is chance.
Yeah, I have a friend who was on a ship in the war that was sunk, and he survived. And I said to him, I said, you never told me you were a hero. He said, I wasn't a hero. He said, I could just swim. But he also pointed out that so many of the fellows on that ship in the Mediterranean were from the Midwest, and at that time they didn't swim. Right. They didn't know how to swim.
Right. Now you say writing about the Second World War now is a feeble act of thanks from my generation, who were able to sleep in their own little rooms, again, only because the brightest and the best had contended with brave resolve against the darkest and the worst. Are we still prepared to take that on, or is your concern that we're not prepared anymore to stand up like we did?
Well, that's a good question, and I think that was one motive behind my writing this, so that we can learn from great things that were done, and we must never forget that. We must never forget the terrible things that were done, and I don't think we can assume that we would be able to go through that now. One warning is ignorance of history. Mm-hmm. People then, whether they had any kind of formal education or not, absorbed through their grandparents and great-grandparents stories and trials of the past. Mm-hmm. And there's a tremendous lack of historical information today. Mm-hmm. I saw an interview recently. A state college student was asked, who was Hitler? Didn't know. I think she said maybe he was a leader of Amsterdam or something. No idea whatsoever. A friend of mine is a professor lecturing at a very distinguished university, was asked by a freshman, you keep saying Second World War, was there a First World War?
Right.
So, you know, and the old saying is, if we don't know our history, we are condemned to repeat it.
Right.
But also remember, in the Second World War, people had gone through all kinds of deprivation. Before that, the Depression.
Sure, right.
They were only briefly removed from the First World War. In fact, the distance between us now, mm-hmm. or between the two world wars, right. is about the distance that we are now from the introduction of the Windows program. Microsoft. Really? That's all.
It would have been about 23 years.
That's
right?
all.
About 23 years.
So in a way, the Second World War was a continuation of the First World War, and that explains the reluctance of the people to engage a war, because they were still traumatized by the horror of the First World War. And what happened in the First World War explains the problem, the dissolution of Europe today.
Mm-hmm. Now, in Chapter 12, ending a year with no end in sight, you actually bring up Dr. Goebbels, okay, Joseph Goebbels, and he hailed the Japanese for being free of the remnants of Christianity that he regretted in his fatherland. You know, because sometimes you get this idea that we like to be told, well, see, you know, Hitler was kind of a Catholic, and the Catholic Church kind of went along with this, and the reality, and as if the Nazis were based in some sort of Christian approach, which isn't true.
No, the swastika is a twisted cross.
Right. It's
not the cross.
Right.
And the National Socialists wanted to create a new religion, mm-hmm. the religion of the state, the great government, and they tried to revive paganism. They really had pagan cults. There was a Nazi wedding ritual, but most people laughed at that. Very similar to what happened in the French Revolution, mm-hmm. when you had various rationalist cults invented to replace Christianity.
Because it has to be replaced. You have to have there has to be something to fill the void, right?
Well, if you're dealing with evil, you're dealing with a hatred of God in all his cultural manifestations. And the valor of so many of the bishops in confronting that is a great tribute to the Church. And it's very clear how Pius XII used the new media, mm-hmm. then it was the radio.
Radio, right.
And you had broadcasts in German mm-hmm. for specific reasons, so that people could get the message. But they knew their history, and the German bishops at one point organized a 600th anniversary celebration of the election of Pope Clement VI. Now, why do that?
Why of all people? Okay.
Well, the reason was that Clement VI in the 14th century was a great protector of the Jews.
Oh, okay.
Who were being amongst other things, blamed for the Black Plague. And the Nazis knew that, and they refused to allow the anniversary celebration. Anybody reading that they banned it would say, you know, what's that all about?
Right.
But both sides knew.
Right, right. Now, you also mentioned, I know, you had a very glowing review of this particular book by George Weigel, and he also brought up a Greek Orthodox Archbishop of Athens. You want to tell us a little bit about his situation?
Well, when the Germans took over, the Gauleiter there was particularly repressive. And the Archbishop, I must say, I admire the Byzantine rites. And he had a ritual cursing of the Gauleiter in the cathedral. I think it was very, very impressive. But then the Gauleiter threatened to shoot him. And the Archbishop recalled how I think it was in 1821 that the Turks had lynched one of his predecessors. And he said, you know, it is the custom of the archbishops of Athens to be hanged and not shot, so please respect our tradition. Great line. So the Gauleiter backed off there.
It's nothing like a little standing up and a little humor at the same time sometimes to change the subject. That's Principalities and Powers, Spiritual Combat 42 to 43. Now let's talk in a few minutes we have about an earlier work you did we didn't get a chance to talk about, Cloud of Witnesses, Dead People I Knew When They Were Alive. What was it that this was done, as a series of articles you had done about people you had known? And what prompted you to start doing that?
Well, I began to reflect on, some of these people are well known, and some are not well known. So the ones who are well known have to be explained better because biographers or the public tend to think of people in terms of well-known people and cliches.
Right, okay.
But I want some of my perspectives, having known these people, the human side, but also there's so many people who would have been forgotten if they weren't recorded now. And I say that these people really accomplished so much because they were impressed, not because they were impressive, just they were, but because they were impressed by God. And I tend to I appreciate the biographical school of history. There's an economic theory of history, political theory. Well, they intertwine. But I think the best way to understand history is to understand the people.
Now you said, the thing I noticed was in the beginning, it's dead people I knew when they were alive, and then you said characters I have known. How did you mean that word character? Just that they were unusual, they were different, they were...
Well, when we say, oh, he's a character, we mean he's funny or eccentric, maybe. But the Greek word character really means it's like a small chisel that you use to engrave a stone. And so when someone has a character, he's been engraved by God. There's a mark of God on him. And the book of Revelation says that in heaven, people are shown their name on a white stone. And that probably alludes to the Roman practice of giving a winner of a competition, of a contest, a white stone. It was with his name on as an admission to the victory banquet. Okay. That's what it's all about. Okay. So these characters really, in one way or another, some more blatantly than others, or more consciously than others, were marked by God, and the virtues are shown through as a witness.
You say these are not biographies, each gave something to me. But by deliberately writing only vignettes, I want to make the point that some passing influence, some remark or circumstance was personal enough to have made me something that I would not have been without them. So these are people you interacted with and who one way or the other, like you said, left an impression on you because of God had impressed them. That's what you were just saying, right?
All right. Every day I walk down streets of Manhattan, and it's much better than any novel. But I'm rather depressed to see how many people now walk around just looking at their iPods and ignoring everything that's going on around them. They're very isolated. Now, a friend of mine I mentioned this in the introduction, had a daughter who went to...
it's the kindergarten story.
The kindergarten for the first time, and she didn't like it. She said she wasn't going to go back, so would I explain to her the importance of school? And I said, no, she's right and you're wrong. They said, we spend too much time at school. Now, I'm a hypocrite when I say that, because I spent much of my life in school. But I think it was Mark Twain who said that there's some people learn without going to college, and that other people go to college and then learn after they get out.
Mm-hmm. Right.
There was a professor, president, I think he was president of Harvard University, who said that the university was a storehouse of knowledge because the freshmen brought so much in and the seniors took so little out. But I said to my friend, I said, what your daughter should do is spend time just dealing with people. You know, hanging around hotel lobbies and going to restaurants and go to garages to see how cars are made and on and on and on. Learn languages by the vendors on the street. Of course, I was being a bit, you know, sardonic, but I had a lot of mail after that from some people who appreciated that, homeschoolers and that, but other people who took offense that I was suggesting that children loiter around in hotel lobbies. Which was not what you were imagining. Some people have no sense of humor.
Well, if they were, they might have run into some of the people just before we go. Blessed Mother Teresa, Robert Frost. You know, I was Wellington Marin here, the New York Giants. Of course, I would know.
He was a very saintly man.
Bowie Kuhn from the former baseball commissioner, who actually I know was involved with the pro-life movement and was actually involved with that. And this one, Father Stanley Yaki, who two of his books on St. Peter and the Rock made a big impression on me when I read them, and I saw him speak years ago.
Science and Religion.
Yes.
I have to say that this is also a tribute to the priesthood, because I would never have met most of these people, well, a lot of before I became a priest, but there's so many in there I would never have met if I had not been a priest with access to such a variety of people.
Well, it's great because now you've given all of us access to these people. We thank you so much for A Cloud of Witnesses, Dead People I Knew When They Were Alive. That's published by Scepter. And the first book we talked about, Principalities and Your Latest and Powers, Spiritual Combat, 1942 to 1943, and that's published by St. Augustine's Press, both available through the EWTN Religious Catalog. Thank you so much for your time, Father. Speaking here with Father George Rutler. Join us next time right here on EWTN's Bookmark.